The emergency beacon had been transmitting for 37 standard cycles, and still no response came from the Galactic Council. Ambassador Kethara of the Zilani Federation pressed her crystalline fingers against the viewing port of the orbital station, watching the small fleet of enemy vessels tighten their blockade around her homeworld below. The sleek, predatory ships of the Vorthak Empire moved with mechanical precision, their dark hulls absorbing the light from Xelon's twin suns. "Still nothing from the Council?" asked Commander Vexnall, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. The insectoid officer had been monitoring communications for days, hoping desperately for any sign that help was coming. Kethara's bioluminescent patches dimmed with despair. "Nothing. The automated response says our request has been logged and will be reviewed in due process." She turned away from the window, her translucent skin showing the blue veins of stress. "Due process, while our people starve below and the Vorthak prepare for their final assault." The Zilani had always been peaceful traders and scholars, their crystalline cities rising like gardens of light across their planet's surface. They had no military to speak of, having relied on the Galactic Council's protection for over 2 centuries. Now that protection seemed as fragile as their glass spires. "Perhaps we should consider the Vorthak's terms," suggested Councillor Rethmus, his elderly form hunched over a data tablet. "Surrender now and they promise to preserve our research facilities. Our knowledge could live on even if our freedom does not. And become slaves in our own laboratories?" Kethara's voice carried a harmonic resonance that made the station's walls vibrate. "Watch them use our discoveries to conquer other peaceful worlds? Never." The Vorthak had arrived 3 months ago with demands that seemed impossible. They wanted exclusive access to Xelon's quantum research, particularly the breakthrough work on dimensional folding that the Xelani had spent generations developing. When the Federation politely declined, pointing to their non-military research accords with the Council, the Vorthak response had been swift and brutal. First came the orbital bombardment of the outer settlements. Then the systematic destruction of communication arrays and transport hubs. Now came the slow strangulation of the entire planet, cutting off all supplies while demanding complete surrender. The Vorthak were patient predators, content to let hunger and desperation do their work. Admiral Threxon's message was clear, Commander Vexnall reported, reading from his console. "Submit within 10 cycles or they begin targeting the population centers directly, starting with New Crystalia." New Crystalia housed over 50 million Zilani civilians. Kethara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of their lives pressing down on her shoulders. The Council had protocols for situations like this, but those protocols seemed designed more for paperwork than protection. "Have we tried reaching out beyond the Council?" she asked suddenly. "To the independent systems? The Free Traders Alliance?" "The Free Traders lack the military capability," Vexnall replied. "And the independent systems." He paused, his compound eyes reflecting uncertainty. "Most are too distant or too weak to challenge the Vorthak Empire." "What about the Rim worlds? The newer colonies?" Councillor Rethmus looked up from his tablet. "You mean the human territories?" "Ambassador, they're barely a century old in galactic terms, a young species with crude technology and no understanding of civilized warfare." Kethara had heard the rumors about humans, though she'd never encountered one personally. They were said to be aggressive, unpredictable creatures who had somehow managed to carve out a small section of space on the galaxy's outer rim. Most Council members considered them little more than an amusing curiosity, too primitive to pose any real threat or offer any meaningful assistance. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "Send a transmission to the human colonies," she ordered. "All of them. Tell them what's happening here." "Ambassador," Rethmus protested, "even if they wanted to help, which is highly unlikely, what could they possibly do? They have no capital ships, no energy weapons worthy of the name. Their fleet consists mainly of converted cargo haulers and mining vessels." "Perhaps," Kethara said quietly, "but they're the only ones who haven't ignored our calls for help." The truth was painful to acknowledge. The Galactic Council, with all its grand proclamations about protecting member species, had reduced their desperate pleas to bureaucratic procedures. The great civilizations that had promised security and support had turned away when real action was required. The Zilani faced extinction while committees debated proper protocols. As if summoned by her thoughts, another transmission arrived from Admiral Threxon. The Vorthak commander appeared on the main screen. His scaled features twisted into what might have been a smile on a less predatory face. Ambassador Kethara. His voice carried the mechanical undertones of his species' translation devices. I trust you have had time to consider our generous offer. Your people's suffering could end today with a simple word from you. Our answer remains the same, Kethara replied, forcing strength into her voice she didn't feel. How unfortunate. I had hoped wisdom would prevail over pride. Threxon's claws tapped against his command chair. Very well. In 6 cycles we will demonstrate the consequences of defiance. The city of Velthara will serve as an example to the rest of your world. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Velthara was home to over 10 million souls, including the grand library that contained millennia of Zelani culture and knowledge. 6 cycles, whispered Commander Vexenal. Kethara stared at the blank screen, feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. The council wouldn't respond in time, even if they intended to respond at all. The Vorthak fleet was too powerful for any last-minute rescue by their few remaining allies. In 6 cycles, her people would begin dying, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But she had sent the message to the humans anyway, broadcasting it toward the Rim territories with what little power they had left. It was a futile gesture, she knew. Even if the humans received it, even if they cared enough to respond, what could one young species do against the might of the Vorthak Empire? The answer, she believed, was nothing at all. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be. Captain Sarah Chen was reviewing supply manifests in her cramped quarters aboard the merchant vessel, Lucky Strike, when the priority transmission came through. The message burst through their communications array with an intensity that made her coffee mug rattle against the metal desk. Emergency beacons were common enough in the Rim territories, usually miners trapped in asteroid fields or colonists dealing with equipment failures. But this signal carried authentication codes she'd never seen before. Bridge to Captain, came the voice of her communications officer, Lieutenant Torres. You're gonna want to hear this personally, ma'am. Sarah made her way to the bridge of her converted freighter, past the jury-rigged weapon systems and reinforced bulkheads that marked her ship as one of the many vessels pressed into dual civilian military service. The human colonies couldn't afford separate merchant and naval fleets, so most ships served both purposes when needed. Play it back, she ordered, settling into her command chair. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unlike anything she'd heard before, musical and resonant with harmonics that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The universal translator struggled with some of the concepts, but the desperation came through clearly enough. This is Ambassador Kethara of the Zelani Federation, transmitting on all frequencies to any vessel capable of receiving this message. Our world is under siege by the Vorthak Empire. They demand our research and threaten to exterminate our population if we refuse. The Galactic Council has been notified but provides no aid. We are alone and our time grows short. If there are any among the stars who value justice in life, please, we beg for your assistance. The bridge fell silent as the message ended. Sarah stared at the communications console, processing what she'd just heard. The Zelani were one of the Council species, renowned throughout the galaxy for their scientific achievements and peaceful nature. If they were being attacked, it represented a massive failure of the Galactic Order. Where did this come from? She asked. Sector 447, ma'am, Torres replied, his fingers dancing over his console. That's deep in Council space, almost 800 light-years from here. And the Vorthak Empire? Military expansionists, offered her tactical officer, Commander Jackson. We've had a few run-ins with their scout ships. They're not exactly friendly neighbors, but this would be their first major aggressive action against a council member. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. 800 light-years. Even with their fastest ships, it would take weeks to reach Zelani space. By then, whatever was happening there would likely be over. But the message had been desperate enough that someone had risked sending it to unknown recipients across the galaxy. Ma'am? Torres spoke up again. I'm picking up similar messages being broadcast from other human vessels in our sector. Word spreading fast, that didn't surprise her. The human colonies maintained an informal but efficient communication network, born from centuries of having to rely on each other rather than outside protection. When one colony faced trouble, word reached the others within hours. Get me Admiral Morrison, Sarah ordered. The face that appeared on her screen 20 minutes later belonged to a woman who looked like she'd been carved from granite and tempered in a forge. Admiral Catherine Morrison commanded the 3rd Colonial Defense Fleet from her flagship, Indomitable, and she'd earned her position through 30 years of keeping human space safe from pirates, raiders, and worse. I assume you've heard the transmission. Captain Chen, Morrison said without preamble. Yes, ma'am. What are your orders? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, her steel-gray eyes studying something off-screen. How many ships do you have in your merchant group right now? 17 vessels, ma'am. Mostly freighters and industrial ships, but we've got defensive capabilities. And your cargo status? Sarah frowned. We're running medical supplies and industrial equipment to the New Brisbane colony. Should arrive in 4 days, she paused. Ma'am, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? Captain, I've been a soldier longer than you've been alive, and I've learned to trust my gut. My gut says that if we don't help the Zilani, we're going to find ourselves in the same position someday, with nobody willing to answer our distress calls. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. An expedition to council space? Ma'am, that's way outside our operational parameters. We don't even have proper military authorization for actions that far from home. Which is why this would be entirely voluntary, Morrison replied. I can't order any vessel to join this mission, but I can ask for volunteers. Before Sarah could respond, Morrison continued. I've been in contact with Admiral Harrison of the 1st Fleet and Admiral Patel of the 2nd. We're all in agreement. The Zilani message represents something we can't ignore. If the Council won't protect its own members, then maybe it's time for someone else to step up. How many ships are we talking about? Every vessel that can make the journey and wants to. Freighters, miners, colony ships, defense platforms, even the old generation ships if they're willing to make one more trip. Morrison's expression grew grim. We're talking about the largest fleet humanity has ever assembled. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The human colonies had never attempted anything on this scale before. Their entire military doctrine was based on defense and small-scale operations. Taking on a major galactic power was beyond anything they'd ever considered. Ma'am, with respect, the Vorthak Empire has been a spacefaring civilization for thousands of years. They have energy weapons, advanced shielding, vessels that outclass anything in our fleet. What makes you think we can succeed where the Council won't even try? Morrison smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Captain, the Council has rules, protocols, committee meetings, and bureaucratic procedures. They're civilized. Her smile widened. We're not. I don't understand. The Vorthak are expecting either surrender or a traditional military response, something predictable, following established patterns of galactic warfare. They're not expecting a swarm of angry humans with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Sarah stared at the screen, trying to process the magnitude of what was being proposed. You're talking about war, Admiral. Real war, not just colonial defense actions. I'm talking about doing what's right regardless of the consequences, Morrison replied. The Zilani asked for help. As far as I'm concerned, that's enough. The communication channel crackled with static for a moment before Morrison continued. I'm sending you the operational parameters. Look them over, discuss it with your crew, and let me know your decision within 6 hours. But Sarah? Morrison's voice softened slightly. Remember that sometimes the only thing standing between innocents and monsters is someone willing to say no more. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone with a decision that would change everything. She could deliver her medical supplies to New Brisbane, maintain her profitable trade routes, and live with the knowledge that she'd chosen safety over justice. Or she could volunteer her ship and crew for a mission that might mean their deaths, fighting for people they'd never met in a conflict that wasn't their responsibility. She called her senior officers to the bridge and played them the Zilani message, followed by Admiral Morrison's proposal. The discussion that followed was heated but brief. In the end, the vote was unanimous. The Lucky Strike would join humanity's first expeditionary fleet. The assembly point was a coordinates designation in empty space, 3 light-years from the nearest star system. Admiral Morrison had chosen it specifically for its isolation, knowing that what they were about to attempt would draw attention from parties who might not approve of human intervention in council affairs. As her flagship Indomitable dropped out of hyperspace at the designated location, she was astonished by what she saw. Hundreds of ships stretched across the void, their running lights creating a constellation of human determination. Massive colony ships that hadn't moved from their positions in decades floated alongside sleek patrol vessels. Mining barges bristled with improvised weapon systems, while converted cargo haulers displayed fresh military markings. Even the ancient generation ship New Horizon, which had carried the first human colonists beyond Earth's solar system, had answered the call. "Fleet count, Admiral," reported her operations officer, Commander Walsh. 437 vessels confirmed, with more arriving every hour. "We've got ships from every human colony, plus a few independent operators who heard about the mission." Morrison studied the tactical display, marveling at the diversity of her impromptu fleet. They had no common command structure, no unified communication protocols, and their weapons systems ranged from cutting-edge plasma cannons to improvised mass drivers built from asteroid mining equipment. By every conventional military standard, it was a disaster waiting to happen. It was also the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Signal from the Lucky Strike, Admiral," communications reported. "Captain Chen reports her merchant group is ready for departure." "And the Steel Phoenix?" "Captain Rodriguez confirms his mining consortium is prepared. They've rigged their ore processors as kinetic bombardment systems." Morrison nodded, impressed despite herself. The human colonies had always been resourceful, but this level of improvisation was remarkable even by their standards. Farmers had converted atmospheric processors into weapons platforms. Scientists had jury-rigged research vessels with military-grade sensors. Even the medical ships had been fitted with defensive systems and loaded with combat supplies. "Admiral," her tactical officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Galactic Council. It's marked as urgent." The face that appeared on the main screen belonged to Counselor Vexa Thala of the Rigelian Hegemony, one of the Council's senior military advisors. His blue-scaled features displayed the carefully neutral expression that Council diplomats were famous for. "Admiral Morrison," Vexa Thala began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official protocol, "we have become aware of unusual fleet movements in human space. The Council wishes to remind you that military action beyond your designated territorial boundaries requires prior authorization from the Department of Interspecies Affairs." Morrison kept her expression carefully neutral. "Counselor Vexa Thala, we're conducting routine training exercises in neutral space. Surely that falls within our sovereign rights." "Admiral, our intelligence sources suggest that your training exercises involve over 400 vessels moving toward Council space. This appears to exceed the scope of normal military maneuvers. Perhaps your intelligence sources should focus on actual threats," Morrison replied coolly, "like the Vorthak fleet currently besieging a Council member world." Vexa Thala's scales shifted color slightly, a sign of agitation among his species. "The Zilani situation is being handled through proper diplomatic channels. Military intervention would only escalate tensions unnecessarily." "Diplomatic channels," Morrison repeated, "while civilians die and cities burn. Admiral, I must strongly advise against any unauthorized military action. The consequences for human-Council relations could be severe." Morrison leaned forward in her command chair. "Counselor, with all due respect, your Council has demonstrated that it's unwilling or unable to protect its own members. Someone needs to step up. The humans are not equipped for large-scale military operations against a major galactic power," Vexa Thala stated flatly. "Your intervention would accomplish nothing except the destruction of your own forces." "Maybe," Morrison conceded, "but at least we'll have tried." The transmission ended with Vexa Thala's obvious frustration, leaving Morrison's bridge crew in tense silence. Everyone understood the implications of what they'd just witnessed. The Council wasn't just refusing to help the Zilani, they were actively trying to prevent anyone else from helping either. "Admiral," Commander Walsh spoke quietly. "That sounded very much like a threat." "It was," Morrison confirmed. "The Council is more concerned about maintaining their political stability than protecting their members. They'd rather let the Zilani fall than risk setting a precedent that challenges their authority." A new voice cut across the bridge communications. "Admiral Morrison, this is Captain Harrison aboard the generation ship New Horizon." The voice was ancient, gravelly with age, but it carried absolute determination. "My ship and crew have been listening to your conversation with the Council. I want you to know that we didn't come all this way to turn back because some bureaucrat got nervous." Similar transmissions began flooding their communications array, captain after captain, ship after ship, all confirming their commitment to the mission despite the Council's warnings. Morrison felt a surge of pride in her species. Whatever else humans might be, They weren't the type to abandon those in need just because it was politically inconvenient. Fleet status report, she ordered. All vessels report ready for hyperspace transit. Walsh confirmed. Estimated travel time to Zalani space is 14 days at maximum sustainable speed. Signal all ships, Morrison commanded. We jump in 1 hour. Anyone who wants to reconsider their participation is free to leave with no questions asked. She watched the tactical display for any signs of ships breaking formation. None did. An hour later, 437 human vessels entered hyperspace, bound for a destination none of them had ever seen. To fight for people they'd never met, against an enemy that outclassed them in every measurable way. The largest fleet in human history was going to war, not for conquest or resources, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Behind them, emergency communications raced through Council space. The human fleet's departure had been detected, and panic was spreading through the galactic government. Some Council members called for immediate sanctions against the human colonies. Others demanded military action to stop the rogue fleet before it could destabilize the carefully maintained balance of power. But deep in Zalani space, Ambassador Cathara received a simple message that made her crystalline features brighten with the first hope she'd felt in months. Help is coming. Hold on. She didn't know what kind of help was on its way or whether it would arrive in time to make a difference. But for the first time since the siege began, she dared to believe that her people might survive after all. The countdown to Velthara's destruction continued, but now it was a race between Vorthak brutality and human determination. The galaxy was about to discover which force was stronger. Admiral Threxon stood on the command deck of his flagship Devastation, watching the orbital bombardment of Velthara's outer districts with cold satisfaction. The Vorthak Empire had perfected the art of siege warfare over millennia, understanding that fear and despair were often more effective weapons than raw firepower. Each precisely targeted strike sent a message to the remaining Zalani population. Surrender now, or watch your civilization die piece by piece. Status report, he commanded, his scaled hands clasped behind his back. Velthara's defensive installations have been neutralized, reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Kethvar. Civilian casualties are minimal so far, as per your instructions. The demonstration is having the desired psychological effect. Threxon nodded approvingly. The Vorthak way of war emphasized efficiency over brutality. Dead populations produced nothing useful, but terrified populations could be remarkably productive under proper management. The Zalani would make excellent research slaves once they accepted the inevitable. Any response from their government? Ambassador Cathara continues to refuse our terms. However, our intelligence suggests growing dissent among their leadership. Several counselors are reportedly pushing for capitulation. Good. Fear is a powerful motivator. Threxon turned to study the tactical display showing his fleet's positions around the Zalani homeworld. 43 vessels of various classes maintained a perfect blockade, their positioning optimized for both defensive coverage and offensive striking power. What of the Galactic Council? Any indication they might actually intervene? Our diplomatic sources suggest the Council remains paralyzed by internal debate, Kethvar reported. Some members advocate for action, but the major powers are unwilling to commit military resources for what they consider a peripheral matter. Threxon's jaw plates shifted in what might have been amusement. Predictable. The Council's weakness has always been their obsession with consensus and procedure. By the time they decide on a course of action, the Zalani will be under our control and the situation will be fait accompli. A new alarm tone echoed across the bridge, interrupting his satisfaction. The sensor operator's mandibles clicked nervously as he studied his displays. Admiral, I'm detecting anomalous hyperspace signatures at the edge of the system, the operator reported. Multiple contacts approaching fast. Galactic Council forces. Threxon demanded, though he doubted it. The Council's military moves were usually preceded by weeks of diplomatic posturing. Unknown, sir. The hyperspace distortions don't match any known Council fleet patterns. Whatever's coming, it's big. Threxon moved to the sensor station, studying the data personally. The readings were indeed unusual, showing dozens of separate hyperspace signatures rather than the coordinated formation typical of military fleets. It looked more like a merchant convoy than a combat force except for the sheer number of contacts. How many vessels? He asked. I'm reading over 400 separate signatures, Admiral. But sir, the energy patterns are strange. These aren't standard military drives. Before Threxon could respond, space at the system's edge erupted with the light of dozens of ships dropping out of hyperspace simultaneously. More followed in waves until the sensor displays showed a massive fleet of mismatched vessels spreading across the outer system. Identification? Threxon snapped. Working on it, sir. The ship designs are unusual. Some appear to be converted civilian vessels, others look like industrial equipment. The sensor operator paused, his expression confused. Admiral, I'm reading human energy signatures. Humans? Threxon's voice carried dangerous undertones. The primitive rim dwellers? What could they possibly want in council space? Incoming transmission, Admiral, reported the communications officer. Audio only, broadcasting on standard frequencies. Put it through. The voice that emerged from the speakers was harsh and direct, lacking the diplomatic niceties that Threxon had grown accustomed to in galactic politics. Vorthak vessels. This is Admiral Catherine Morrison of the Human Colonial Defense Forces. You are ordered to withdraw from Zalani space immediately and release your blockade of the planet below. Threxon stared at the communications panel in genuine disbelief. Did they just order us to withdraw? Apparently so, Admiral, Kethvar replied, his own confusion evident. Open a channel, Threxon commanded. When the connection was established, he injected every ounce of authority and menace into his voice. Unknown human commander, you are trespassing in a declared military operational zone. Withdraw your forces immediately or face the consequences. Negative, came the immediate response. The Zalani Federation requested assistance and we're here to provide it. This is your final warning to withdraw peacefully. Threxon looked around his bridge, noting the expressions of bewilderment on his officers' faces. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered such audacity from such an obviously inferior force. Human Admiral, he said slowly, are you aware that my fleet consists of 43 military vessels armed with the latest Vorthak technology? Your collection of converted cargo haulers and mining barges represents no threat to my forces whatsoever. Maybe not individually, Morrison replied, but we didn't come here to fight fair. The transmission ended, leaving Threxon staring at the tactical display in growing amazement. The human fleet was indeed massive, but his analysis confirmed that most of the vessels were civilian conversions with minimal military capability. Some appeared to be centuries old, relics from an earlier era of human expansion. A few larger ships showed more promising energy signatures, but nothing that would pose a serious threat to Vorthak military technology. Orders, Admiral? Kethvar asked. Signal the humans again, Threxon decided. Perhaps they simply don't understand the situation. When the channel opened, he tried a more diplomatic approach. Admiral Morrison, I respect your desire to assist the Zalani, but you must understand that this is beyond your capabilities. Withdraw now, and I give you my word that your ships will be allowed to leave unmolested. Can't do that, Admiral Threxon, Morrison replied, somehow knowing his name. We made a promise to the Zalani, and humans keep their promises. Then you will die for nothing, Threxon stated flatly. We'll see about that. The human fleet began moving into the inner system, their formation chaotic and undisciplined compared to Vorthak military precision. Threxon watched their approach with a mixture of professional interest and genuine puzzlement. Either the humans were supremely confident in some hidden capability, or they were about to commit spectacular suicide. Battle stations, he ordered. Target the largest vessels first. Perhaps destroying a few ships will convince the rest to see reason. As his fleet moved to intercept the human advance, Threxon found himself feeling an emotion he rarely experienced: uncertainty. Not about the outcome of the battle. His forces held overwhelming advantages in technology, training, and firepower. But something about the humans' behavior didn't fit any pattern he recognized. In his experience, inferior forces either retreated immediately when faced with superior opposition, or charged recklessly into battle and were quickly destroyed. The humans were doing neither. They advanced with purpose but not haste, maintaining formations that made no sense by conventional military standards. It was as if they knew something he didn't. The first shots of the battle would be fired within minutes, and Threxon still couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial about these strange newcomers and their impossible mission. Captain Sarah Chen watched the Vorthak fleet closing on her position, and felt her stomach tighten with familiar pre-battle nerves. The Lucky Strike was positioned in the center of Merchant Squadron 7, surrounded by 17 other converted freighters whose crews had volunteered for what might well be a suicide mission. Around them, the larger human fleet moved in patterns that would have given military tacticians nightmares. "Distance to target," she asked her tactical officer. "Vorthak lead elements will be in weapons range in 4 minutes," Commander Jackson reported. "Their formation is textbook perfect. Cruisers in the lead, destroyers flanking, and that monster dreadnought hanging back with the command group." Sarah nodded, studying her tactical display. The Vorthak ships moved with mechanical precision, their dark hulls bristling with energy weapons that could punch through her improvised armor like paper. By every measure of conventional warfare, the humans should have been running for their lives. Instead, they were about to prove that humans had never been particularly conventional. "Signal from Admiral Morrison," reported Lieutenant Torres. "Operation Swarm is authorized to commence." Sarah keyed her fleet communications. "All vessels, this is Chen. Execute pattern Alpha 7 on my mark." She paused, watching the distance close between the fleets. "Remember, we're not trying to slug it out with them. We're trying to confuse the hell out of them." Mark. What happened next would have been impossible with any properly trained military force. The human fleet suddenly scattered like a flock of startled birds, individual ships breaking formation to race off in seemingly random directions. Some vessels accelerated toward the planet below, others angled for the system's outer edge, and a few simply stopped dead in space. From Admiral Threxon's perspective aboard the Devastation, it looked like the human formation had simply collapsed under pressure. "They're breaking," shouted his tactical officer with satisfaction. "Admiral, they're scattering in all directions." "Pursue the fleeing vessels," Threxon ordered. "Destroy enough of them to convince the rest to surrender." His fleet split into pursuit groups, chasing after what appeared to be panicking human ships. The Vorthak vessels were faster and more maneuverable than the converted civilian craft, and they quickly began closing distance on their targets. That's when the first surprise hit them. The human ship, Prairie Wind, a converted agricultural transport, suddenly spun around to face its Vorthak pursuers. Instead of weapons, it deployed what looked like farming equipment, massive seed-spreading devices that had been modified for a very different purpose. "What are they doing?" Threxon demanded, watching the tactical display in confusion. His answer came seconds later as the Prairie Wind released thousands of small objects into space, creating a dense cloud of debris between itself and the pursuing Vorthak destroyers. The enemy ships tried to maneuver around the obstruction, but the objects weren't random junk. They were guided mining charges, programmed to seek out the largest energy signatures in the area. The leading Vorthak destroyer, Claw of Vengeance, disappeared in a massive explosion as dozens of mining charges detonated against its hull simultaneously. The ship behind it suffered heavy damage from shrapnel and debris, its sleek lines marred by crater impacts. "Clever," Threxon admitted grudgingly. "But they can't have many of those devices." He was right. The humans didn't have many mining charge dispensers. They had something better: imagination. The cargo ship Heavy Haul suddenly disgorged its entire load of construction materials, creating an instant asteroid field that forced the pursuing Vorthak cruiser to reduce speed. Hidden among the legitimate debris were industrial fabricators, mobile construction units that immediately began assembling defensive platforms from the scattered materials. Meanwhile, the ancient generation ship New Horizon had deployed what appeared to be its entire complement of shuttlecraft. But these weren't ordinary shuttles. Each one carried a small crew and enough explosives to cripple a warship. They swarmed toward the Vorthak formation like angry insects, too small and numerous for the enemy's targeting systems to track effectively. "Admiral," his sensor operator called out in alarm, "I'm reading massive energy signatures from the human medical ships. They're powering up some kind of directed energy system." Threxon spun to look at the display, seeing the hospital ships that had been hanging back suddenly surge forward. What he didn't know was that human medical vessels carried powerful surgical lasers for emergency operations, and creative engineers had found ways to amplify their output significantly. The Vorthak cruiser Death's Shadow found itself under concentrated laser fire from 3 hospital ships, their precisely focused beams cutting through armor that was designed to withstand explosive impacts, but not surgical precision. The massive warship began venting atmosphere from dozens of perfectly circular holes. "This is insane," Threxon muttered, watching his orderly battle plan disintegrate into chaos. "They're using medical equipment as weapons." The human fleet wasn't fighting like a military force at all. They were fighting like exactly what they were: miners, farmers, doctors, and merchants who had turned their everyday tools into instruments of war. Every ship in the human fleet carried equipment designed for civilian purposes. But creative minds had found ways to weaponize everything from atmospheric processors to sewage recycling systems. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "Captain Vexthal of the Blade Runner is requesting immediate support. He's being attacked by what appears to be a garbage scow." "A garbage scow?" "The ship is launching compressed waste packages at high velocity. They're using their garbage compactor as a mass driver." Threxon closed his eyes briefly, trying to process the sheer audacity of using trash as ammunition. When he opened them again, the tactical situation had gotten even worse. Admiral Morrison's flagship Indomitable had finally engaged directly, and it was nothing like the improvised weapons of the civilian fleet. The human military vessel mounted what appeared to be scaled-up versions of mining equipment, but these devices had clearly been designed for war from the beginning. Particle beam projectors that could core asteroids were equally effective at coring starships. "Admiral," Kethvar reported, his voice tight with worry, "we're losing ships faster than anticipated. The human tactics are unconventional." That was an understatement. The humans weren't following any recognized pattern of space combat. They used weapons that shouldn't have been effective, tactics that violated every principle of military doctrine, and equipment that had no business being in a space battle. And somehow, it was working. "Fall back to defensive positions around the planet," Threxon ordered. "Concentrate our firepower and force them to come to us." But as his fleet began to withdraw, he realized that the humans had already achieved their primary objective. The Vorthak blockade of the Zalani homeworld was broken, and supplies were already beginning to flow to the besieged planet below. For the first time in his military career, Admiral Threxon was beginning to understand why the Galactic Council found humans so unpredictable. They didn't fight wars the way civilized species were supposed to. They fought them like barbarians with access to advanced technology. The truly terrifying part was how effective that combination could be. Ambassador Kethara watched from her orbital station as impossible things happened in the space around her homeworld. Human vessels were everywhere, their chaotic formations weaving between the retreating Vorthak ships like scavengers harassing apex predators. Her people's sensors, designed for scientific observation rather than military analysis, struggled to track the furious dance of battle unfolding around them. "Ambassador," Commander Vexnall called out, his compound eyes wide with amazement, "I'm receiving supply manifests from multiple human vessels. They're requesting permission to begin emergency relief operations." "Supply manifests?" Kethara moved to his station, reading the transmitted data with growing astonishment. The humans weren't just fighting the Vorthak fleet. They were simultaneously preparing to address the humanitarian crisis below. Medical supplies, food packages, industrial equipment for rebuilding damaged infrastructure, even cultural preservation materials to protect Zalani archives. How could they have prepared all this so quickly? She wondered aloud. According to the manifest, they stripped supplies from dozens of human colonies, Vexnall reported. Their entire relief fleet was assembled and dispatched within days of receiving our distress call. Kethara's bioluminescent patches flickered with emotions her species had no words for. The humans had literally taken food from their own mouths to feed strangers they'd never met. The gesture went beyond alliance or treaty obligations. It was pure compassion made manifest. "Grant them landing permissions," she ordered. "Broadcast evacuation coordinates for the damaged sectors." As she spoke, new explosions lit up the void nearby. A Vorthak destroyer had made the mistake of engaging what appeared to be a human agricultural vessel, only to discover that crop-dusting equipment made extremely effective chemical weapons when properly modified. The enemy ship drifted helplessly as its crew succumbed to industrial-strength pesticides that had been repurposed for combat. "Incoming transmission from the human flagship," her communications officer announced. The face that appeared on Kethara's screen belonged to a human female with steel-gray hair and eyes that held depths of experience. Despite the ongoing battle, Admiral Morrison appeared completely calm. "Ambassador Kethara, I'm Admiral Catherine Morrison of the Human Colonial Defense Forces. My apologies for the delayed introduction. but we've been somewhat busy since our arrival. Admiral Morrison, Kethara replied, her voice carrying harmonic undertones of gratitude. Your arrival has given my people hope when we had none left. How can the Zalani Federation assist your operations? Actually, Ambassador, we were hoping you could help us with something. Our tactical analysis suggests the Vorthak are regrouping for a final assault on your population centers. We can hold them off, but we need to end this decisively before they bring in reinforcements. What do you need from us? Morrison's expression grew predatory. We understand the Zalani have been working on dimensional folding technology. Would it be possible to create localized spatial distortions on command? Kethara's crystalline features brightened with understanding. You want to trap their ships? Something like that. We've noticed that Vorthak vessels rely heavily on their mobility and formation tactics. Take that away, and they become much more manageable targets. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Zalani dimensional research had focused on transportation and communication applications, but the same principles could be weaponized with the right modifications. Spatial distortions could prevent enemy ships from maneuvering, or even prevent them from firing weapons accurately. I'll contact our research facilities immediately, Kethara promised. How much time do we have? Admiral Threxon is smart, Morrison replied. He'll reorganize his forces and try to force us into a conventional engagement where his technological advantages matter more. I'd estimate we have maybe 6 hours before he's ready to make his move. The transmission ended, leaving Kethara to coordinate with her planet's greatest scientific minds. Within minutes, emergency conferences were being held across Zalan's research network. The challenge was immense, converting peaceful scientific equipment into tactical weapons systems in a matter of hours. But the Zalani had advantages that Threxon couldn't have anticipated. Their entire civilization was built around cooperative problem-solving and rapid innovation. When properly motivated, they could accomplish remarkable things in very little time. Meanwhile, the space battle continued to rage with increasing intensity. The humans had learned to avoid direct confrontations with Vorthak warships, instead using their superior numbers and unconventional tactics to inflict death by 1,000 cuts. Mining vessels deployed clouds of metallic chaff that interfered with enemy sensors. Transport ships released construction robots that swarmed over Vorthak hulls, dismantling weapons and engine systems. Even the civilian evacuation ships carried defensive systems jury-rigged from emergency equipment. Admiral Threxon found himself fighting a war unlike anything in his experience. His enemies refused to follow proper military protocols, used weapons that shouldn't have existed, and displayed a reckless disregard for their own safety that bordered on insanity. Every time he thought he understood their tactics, they introduced some new improvisation that turned his assumptions upside down. Status report, he demanded, from his tactical officer. We've lost 12 vessels destroyed and 18, more damaged beyond combat effectiveness, Kethvar reported grimly. The humans have taken losses as well, but their numbers are overwhelming. For every ship we destroy, 3 more take its place. And our reinforcements? The nearest fleet is 6 days away, assuming they depart immediately. Threxon studied the tactical display, noting how his remaining ships had been forced into defensive positions around key Vorthak installations. The humans controlled most of the system now, their chaotic formations somehow managing to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Signal the fleet, he decided. We'll consolidate our remaining forces and break through their lines to attack the planet directly. If we can force them to defend fixed positions, we can negate their mobility advantage. It was a sound strategy under normal circumstances. Unfortunately for Threxon, nothing about this battle had been normal from the beginning. As his ships began forming up for their final assault, space around them suddenly began to twist and distort. Reality itself seemed to bend as the Zalani dimensional equipment came online, creating pockets of warped spacetime that made accurate navigation impossible. What's happening? Threxon shouted as his flagship lurched sideways, caught in a gravitational anomaly that shouldn't have existed. Unknown spatial distortions throughout the combat zone, his sensor operator reported, his voice tight with panic. Our navigation systems can't compensate. We're trapped. Threxon realized, too late, that he had underestimated both his human opponents and their Zalani allies. The humans had fought with primitive cunning and impossible courage, but the Zalani had provided the scientific precision needed to turn chaos into victory. As human ships closed in on his trapped fleet, Admiral Threxon prepared to face the consequences of challenging a species that had never learned the meaning of the word impossible. The Vorthak flagship Devastation hung motionless in twisted space, its mighty engines straining against dimensional distortions that made movement impossible. Around it, the remainder of Admiral Threxon's fleet found themselves similarly trapped, their sophisticated navigation systems useless against Zilani science that bent the very fabric of reality. Admiral Morrison watched the tactical display from her command chair, aboard the Indomitable, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The battle had lasted 18 hours, and her improvised fleet had taken heavy casualties. 43 human vessels had been destroyed, with another 60 suffering significant damage. But they had achieved something that many thought impossible. They had defeated a major galactic military power. "Signal Admiral Threxon," she ordered. "Let's see if we can end this without more bloodshed." The Vorthak commander's face appeared on her screen, his scaled features rigid with barely controlled fury. Behind him, Morrison could see his bridge crew working frantically at damaged consoles. "Admiral Morrison," Threxon said, his voice carrying the bitter taste of defeat. "It seems you have proven me wrong about human capabilities." "Admiral, you're trapped and outnumbered," Morrison replied calmly. "Your reinforcements are days away, and my fleet controls this entire system. I'm prepared to offer you terms for surrender." "Terms?" Threxon's jaw plates shifted in what might have been dark amusement. "What terms could you possibly offer that would interest the Vorthak Empire?" "Safe passage out of Zilani space for your surviving vessels and crews," Morrison said immediately. "No pursuit, no retaliation, provided you withdraw completely and permanently from this system." Threxon stared at her in genuine surprise. In his experience, victorious enemies either demanded unconditional surrender or simply destroyed defeated forces outright. The concept of allowing a beaten foe to retreat with dignity was foreign to Vorthak military culture. "And in return?" he asked cautiously. "You leave the Zilani alone," Morrison stated firmly. "Permanently. No future claims on their territory. No demands for their research. No interference with their government. Complete withdrawal from this sector of space." "You would trust the word of a defeated enemy?" Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "Admiral, if you break this agreement, I promise you that every human fleet in existence will come looking for you. And next time, we'll be better prepared." The threat carried weight precisely because it was delivered so matter-of-factly. Threxon had seen what one hastily assembled human fleet could accomplish. The prospect of facing multiple such forces, all of them learning from this battle's lessons, was genuinely terrifying. "I need to consult with my superiors," he said finally. "You have 2 hours," Morrison replied. "After that, we start boarding your vessels." The transmission ended, leaving Threxon to contemplate the ruins of his military career. The Vorthak Empire would not take defeat well, especially defeat at the hands of a supposedly primitive species, but the alternative to surrender was annihilation, and at least surrender left open the possibility of future revenge. While negotiations continued, human relief ships had already begun landing on the Zilani homeworld. Captain Sarah Chen found herself commanding one of the first supply convoys to reach the surface, her converted freighter loaded with medical supplies and emergency food stocks. The Zilani capital of New Crystalia was a marvel of organic architecture, its spires growing from the landscape like enormous crystal formations, but many of those beautiful structures showed the scars of Vorthak bombardment, their surfaces cracked and darkened by weapons fire. "Landing pad 7 is clear for approach," came the transmission from Zilani ground control, the musical harmonics of their language translated into flat human speech. As Sarah's ship touched down, she saw crowds of Zilani civilians gathering at a respectful distance. Their translucent skin showed patterns of bioluminescence that her cultural briefings had identified as expressions of gratitude and amazement. Many of them had never seen humans before, and the sight of alien ships bringing aid rather than conquest was clearly overwhelming. Ambassador Cathara was waiting at the landing pad, her crystalline features bright with emotions that needed no translation. As Sarah descended the cargo ramp, the Zilani diplomat approached with graceful movements that seemed to flow like liquid light. "Captain Chen," Cathara said, her harmonious voice carrying through universal translators, "on behalf of all Zilani people, I thank you for your sacrifice and courage. You have saved our civilization. We just did what anyone should do. Sarah replied, slightly embarrassed by the formal gratitude. Nobody should have to face extinction alone. But they do, Kithara said quietly. Throughout the galaxy, worlds fall to stronger powers while their neighbors look away and committees debate. What you have done here is unprecedented. As medical teams began unloading critical supplies, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of their success. The human fleet had proven that the established galactic order could be challenged, that small powers could stand up to larger ones if they had sufficient courage and creativity. Back in space, Admiral Morrison received word that Admiral Threxon had accepted her terms. The Vorthak fleet would withdraw immediately, with safe passage guaranteed as long as they departed Zilani space within 12 hours. It was an unconditional victory, achieved at tremendous cost but with consequences that would echo throughout the galaxy. Admiral, her communications officer reported, we're receiving priority transmissions from the Galactic Council. Multiple channels all marked urgent. I'll bet they are, Morrison muttered. The Council had spent weeks ignoring Zilani pleas for help, then tried to prevent human intervention. Now they were undoubtedly scrambling to control the political fallout from the battle. Put them through, she decided. The face that appeared on her screen belonged to Supreme Counselor Vex Thalan, the Regelian hegemony's highest diplomatic representative. His blue scales were pale with what Morrison recognized as extreme agitation. Admiral Morrison, Vexathalan began without preamble, the Council demands an immediate explanation for your unauthorized military action in Council space. Your fleet's intervention has created a diplomatic crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Counselor, Morrison replied calmly. My fleet responded to a distress call from a Council member world. We provided assistance that the Council was apparently unwilling or unable to provide. The Zilani situation was being handled through proper diplomatic channels, while civilians died and cities burned, Morrison stated flatly. Your diplomatic channels failed, Counselor. Someone had to act. The consequences of your actions extend far beyond this single system, Vexthalan continued, his voice rising. You have destabilized the established balance of power, encouraged other minor species to consider military solutions to political problems, and demonstrated a dangerous precedent for intervention without Council authorization. Morrison leaned forward in her command chair. Counselor, with all due respect, maybe it's time the established balance of power was destabilized. Maybe minor species should consider military solutions when the major powers abandon them, and maybe Council authorization isn't worth much if it never actually leads to action. The Rigelian diplomat's scales flushed darker blue, a clear sign of anger. Admiral, the Council will not tolerate this level of insubordination from member species. There will be consequences for your actions. Let me save you some time, Counselor, Morrison replied. The human colonies formally withdraw our application for Council membership, effective immediately. We have no interest in joining an organization that values procedure over principles. The transmission ended with Vexthalan's shocked expression frozen on the screen. Around Morrison's bridge, her officers exchanged glances of mixed concern and satisfaction. They had burned their bridges with the galactic government, but they had also proven that humans could stand on their own. In the days that followed, word of the Battle of Zelan spread throughout the galaxy. The story of how hundreds of converted civilian ships had defeated a major military power captured imaginations across dozens of species. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Galactic Council's authority was neither absolute nor unchallengeable. Other minor species began looking at their own defense capabilities with new eyes. Pirates and raiders found their activities increasingly dangerous as independent worlds started fighting back with human-inspired tactics. The careful stability that the Council had maintained for centuries began showing cracks that would eventually grow into fundamental changes. But for the moment, in the crystal cities of Zelan, celebration replaced fear. The Zilani had been saved by strangers who asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that justice had been served. It was a lesson that would be remembered long after the last human ship had departed their space. Ambassador Kethara stood in her rebuilt office, looking up at the stars through transparent crystal walls. Somewhere out there, human vessels were carrying word of their victory back to the Rim territories. Other fleets were undoubtedly being assembled, ready to answer the next call for help from those who had nowhere else to turn.